Let's stretch our Distress Oxides today. So we've all seen how great Distress Oxides are at layering and adding that lovely texture to our card making, art journaling and mixed media projects. And there are lots of great YouTube videos that you can find on this subject. I've even got one with a step-by-step of an art journal page that I did, and you can find the links to that in the cards in the description. But for today, I thought we could delve just a little bit deeper and experiment on some different surfaces and see how they react and discover what works and what doesn't work. So let's jump straight on in with fabric. For this experiment, I'm using heavyweight muslin or calico, and we will just start with some simple stamping. Now don't forget that all the products I've used are listed in the description. Now Distress Oxides are so juicy that they will stamp on fabric surface, and both the block shape stamp and the more detailed stamp give a nice image with the Distress Oxides on the fabric. But if you want better coverage or for the image to sink into the fabric rather than just sit on the surface, then try adding water. So I've not actually re-inked my stamps after that first image you saw. This is in fact a second generation stamping, but I have spritzed the stamp with water before stamping. And you can see there was plenty enough Distress Oxide still on the stamp to give me a really nice second generation image for both the block stamp and for the detailed stamp too. Okay, how about brayering the ink? Well, first up, let's just try straight from the ink pad. And again, it covers the fabric by just sitting on the surface. Now, if I spray that inked area with water, you get a much better coverage and spreading of the ink. And then let's just try spraying the ink that's left on the brayer and rolling that out on the fabric. And this time you get much better movement and coverage of the ink, plus it will seep into the fabric as well. Next, I wanted to try the technique that you often see used with adding Distress Oxides to cardstock, and it's great for adding that Distress Oxide texture that you can get. So I'm just pressing the ink pads onto a non-absorbent surface and spritzing them with water, and then I'm just going to use the fabric the same way as I would use cardstock, so moving it through that colour and letting it pick it up, and then trying to just add some layers by dotting it into the colour again. I'm also going to compare it to what happens when you actually wet the fabric beforehand. So the blue end is where I wetted the fabric first, and the more greeny yellow end is where the fabric was dry. It's a lot easier to get good coverage if you wet the fabric first. There isn't as much movement on the dry fabric, so you need to take more time if you want it to be completely covered. But you do get some lovely textures on the dry fabric, which you don't get on the wet fabric. It's much more diffused. So it might be worth wetting the fabric first, getting that good coverage, and then letting it dry before building up any texture. Now let's have a look at how it works on the translucent paper Vellum. If I just wipe the Distress Oxide ink pad directly on the surface of the paper, just see how lusciously that ink goes onto that paper. It looks really rich. And the great thing about Vellum is that you're looking at both sides, so don't forget to turn your page over to see the effect on the other side. This is the bonus of using this ink on the translucent paper. Distress Oxide ink will stay wet for a very long time, so it means that you've got ample time to do a lot of different techniques with it, such as colour mixing with another ink pad. If we try just some ordinary stamping with the Distress Oxides on the vellum paper, you do really get a nice, sharp, crisp image that you can see on both sides of the paper. But do remember it's going to take a while for that image to dry, so try not to touch it. Okay, let's see what happens if we now take that stamp, and I've not re-inked it, and stamp it into that layer of wet ink that's on the vellum, and you get an interesting image. Still stamps really well, but you get the mixing of those colours. So if I just clean off my stamp this time and stamp it blank, uninked, into that wet Distress Oxide ink, and again you get a really nice image, and don't forget to turn the page over and see what it looks like on the other side. So these might be two very useful techniques to try for your next mixed media, art journal or card making project. And if you do, don't forget to let me know, because I would love to see what you make. So link me in on any of your social media shares where you've used it, and all my links are below. And there's a handy little byproduct of this technique in that it's a great way to get multicoloured stamped images. So think about how you're going to use this as well when you try this technique out. If the tips and techniques that I'm sharing with you today are useful, then please do like the video, share it with your friends, and you can also subscribe to my channel for more. Okay, let's hit up surface number 3, Yupo. Now Yupo is a synthetic paper sheet made from polypropylene, so it has a super smooth surface and is non-absorbent. And before you ask, the paper I have here is Yupo, it's just under a different brand name. Just as with the Vellum, the ink pad swiped directly on the Yupo surface looks really rich. But this is going to take even longer to dry, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in the video, as it's quite a major aspect of working with Distress Oxides. And you can also use that stamping into the wet ink technique that I demonstrated with the Vellum sample. So what about using with water and building up layers? Well, run it through spritzed ink and you get a lovely rich coverage of the surface. But keep going and the colour is diluted out and you don't build up any of those textured layers that you get on paper or fabric. And you're left with a wash of colour on the surface instead. And if I mop up the leftover droplets on a clean piece of Yupo, then I can get a lovely dotty texture. Oh, and I'll just quickly stamp with the ink so you can see how that looks. And it's a nice crisp image. Now let's try building up layers on partly dry samples. So where the Distress Oxides were at their thinnest, that area is dry, but any areas where the Distress Oxide are pulled, they're still wet. Working with Distress Oxides on Yupo is far more challenging than using paper because the ink just takes so long to dry and will not adhere to the surface, so you can still rub it off even if it is dry. You do get some really interesting textures though with the Yupo, but they just aren't stable enough to keep for a long time. However, there might be other applications short term that you can use them for where you're not worried that the work is going to be touched or rubbed. Then perhaps it's worth thinking about the Yupo then. The direct Vellum sample took a good few hours to dry, but I really liked how the other side looked. Colour was still nice, rich and dark. And I'm looking forward to trying that out with some of that stamping technique that I showed. For the fabric, I think it worked really well where you use it with water. Any of the places that I used it directly, just stamping directly with the ink or using the brayer, for example, the ink just sat on the surface and you could still dab it off several days later. So I hope that's given you some food for thought and some experiments to try out yourself. Let me know how you get on and tell me what surfaces you've been using your Distress Oxides on. Thanks for watching and I look forward to seeing you again next week.